Oh, wow. It's a Lua lager. Nice. All right. Well, man, since we're all alone out here in the forest, next to our campfire, and it looks like a safe place, you know, I think this is the nice place for us to sit and tell some ghost stories. You guys know ghost stories, right? You know a few, okay. Yeah, I mean, we could talk history till we're, blue in the mouth. We can do all that, but let's tell some ghost stories tonight. Sure. Pat, do you know a couple ghost stories?
A couple. In fact, there's one I've just learned, which is pretty horrible. I mean, it really is. And we've all been by the place, and we were discussing it on Facebook, as a matter of fact. And a man called me and said, "Don't you know that place is haunted? I go there every day." And I said, "So tell me the story." All right, you've all seen it and wondered about it. And you go down on 6th Street and about Broadway, and there is a building with no windows, no ceiling, curved front. What in the world is that building? And there are a lot of guesses about it. And here's what the man told me. He rents, it's a parking structure. It's a parking lot. And the man rents a space there. And occasionally, as he's walking back to his parking space, he panics. This is a businessman. He's got an office in the Heritage Building next door. But he panics walking to his car. And the closer he gets to the car, the more frightened he becomes. Until by the time he said, thank heavens he's got the fob, because if he had to use a key, he would never be able to unlock the door. And his breath becomes short, his mouth is dry, his hands are shaking. He gets in the car and he just wants nothing more than to get out of there. And so as he pulls his car out onto 6th, on Broadway to turn on 6th, it's a sudden feeling of relief. And he could not understand what in the world was going on. He thought perhaps overwork. And this subject came up of this building, and then your winner here, John Gentry, filled in on some of the details. And that had been, as you can, I think you can tell by the architecture, it was a car lot. It was an auto parts store. And then of late, it was a auto repair shop. And the gentleman that lived there was divorced, and his son, he and his son were going to go hunting. It was just this time of year. They were coming up on the Veterans Day weekend, and they were going to go hunting together. So he decided the boy should sleep overnight in the shop while he caught up on his work. And his dog, Fast, was going to come with him, so they tied Fast up to a bench. And the little boy went to bed, and the father continued to work on a car. And suddenly, something happened, and an immense fire erupted. And they could hear, for blocks away, explosions and thuds as the cans of fluids blew up in that building. The fire department had to get up on the roof of the Heritage Building and aim the fire down on it. The boy's mother came from, someone had called her, obviously, because she came. And she said, "If you can find Fast, my son got out." The fire department had found the father sitting at the side of the road, badly burned. And so find Fast. Well, he found Fast, unfortunately. And Fast was still tied to the bench. And later, as they worked their way back through the building, at the very back of the building where this man parked his car, they found the remains of the little boy, who unfortunately now would never get to go on his hunting trip. You can imagine the feeling of being trapped and the terror that was now coming down through the years to this gentleman walking back through that structure to get to his car.
That's incredible, Pat. And you wrote the book Darkness Next Door. You're working on a new book right now. You have uncovered so many stories of Vancouver and Clark County history, and also of some of these haunting tales that we know. And one of the places that I think both you and Jeff have had experience with is the Slocum House. And that's a place that's really prominent in our downtown. And the cool thing is the Slocum House originally was 1 block south of where it's at today. And it was built by Charles and Laura Slocum back in 1877. And it was a part of this regal, kind of elegant area where there were a bunch of different mansions and people who were very prominent in the community. And so this was a very prominent home. Lots of parties and life happened there. But one of the things we know is that Charles and Laura never ended up having any children, and that they would have community children come over, and they would, do things for them around, but that they kind of lived a life of solitude to some degree when it came to family life. And the funny thing is over the years, both you and Jeff have heard so many stories from the Slocum House. It's considered one of the most haunted places in the city of Vancouver, but we don't know of a single person that actually passed away in that house. But there's so many stories, and working at the museum, I think this is kind of a call to what you did with the Darkness Next Door, is sitting in that research library down at the museum. When you start talking about buildings, sometimes you end up talking about some of these haunting stories that people present. And I was down there one time, and this gentleman who was running a gallery in there, he told me a story that I cannot forget. So this story was one evening. So the Slocum House is owned by the city of Vancouver, and one evening there was a call to the city that an alarm was going off at the Slocum House. And this happened from time to time. It's in the middle of the park, and so it's very easy to think that maybe someone broke in or messed with the door or got in there and is kind of rooting around, or something's happening. And so this wasn't out of the norm. So the city dispatched an operations worker to go and basically assess the property and then shut the alarm off. So the worker gets to the house, and he goes and he's looking around, and he really doesn't see any broken windows. He doesn't see any points of entry, nothing that had happened to the building. And so he figures, okay, I'll go inside and take a look and see if everything's locked up. And so he goes in the front door, locks the door behind him, and starts looking at every window on that kind of main floor. And eventually he starts going down into the basement, and he's walking around in the basement. And he's just kind of looking, and he had heard things about stories people had told in the past and in different tales. So obviously maybe a little bit of the hair was standing up on the back of his neck. But he doesn't see anything in the basement. All the windows are locked, and there's really nothing going on down there. And so he's like, okay, there's nothing here in the basement. So he goes up to the main floor, and he starts rooting around on the main floor, checking windows, checking doors, looking to see if someone was hiding somewhere. Again, he's not finding anything, and just as he's about to, and if you've ever been to the Slocum House, that front entry stairway kind of curves up, right, as it goes up to the upstairs, and you can kind of feel sometimes, like as you're going, like someone could peer around a corner or something to look at you, and he's all of a sudden making his way towards those stairs, and he starts to hear just these really heavy footsteps on that second story. And they're just walking around, and you know when you hear footsteps, you can kind of tell, like, it's your home, and you hear those like tiny little scurry of footsteps, and maybe it's a kid or someone that's in your house, or maybe it's a family member. You can tell by their gait or their step. And this one, it sounded like it was a very large person walking around with very heavy boots on, just these big, daunting steps. And so the city worker thinks, I don't want to pay to do this. I'm going to call the police. So he leaves the house, and he locks everything up, and he calls the Vancouver police. And the VPD, they come out, and they sit there and they talk with the worker for a few about what he did and what he saw and how he looked around the property, and there was nothing strange that he thought was out of the norm. And so finally they're like, okay, we'll go inside and we'll investigate. So they go in, the worker lets them in, and they do the same process. They look around, they go down in the basement, they don't see anything down there, and then they come up onto the main floor, and they're looking around, and there's Everything's secure, doors are locked, there's not a peep, it's just perfectly silent in the house. And again, just as they're about to head up towards that second story, they begin to hear those heavy footsteps plodding on the second story. And so they say, okay, well, we need to go find out who this is. So one officer, because the way the house works is there's 2 sets of stairs, and you can go up one set, and then you can go up another set, and you make it to the main hallway. And so they both do that. They both go up, one goes up one set in the back, one goes up one set in the front, and they end up at the other ends of this hallway, and you can't actually see each other from the end of that hallway, but you know, if you haven't been to the Slocum house and you haven't thought of kind of what the hallway looks like, think of, you know, those old haunted houses from like those old scary movies with the real narrow, long hallways with lots of wood and darkness. Then times it by 10. And little doors and little cubbies that go to nowhere where if there's someone up there, they can grab you fairly easily. Just imagine that. And these 2 officers are braving this obvious death trap. And so they slowly start to walk to where they can actually see each other from one opposite end, you know, of the hallway, and they don't hear anything. It's perfectly silent upstairs. And then all of a sudden, in one of the rooms that's just off to the side, they begin to hear the heavy, plodding footsteps pacing around just aimlessly. These steps just sound like they're just aimlessly walking in no direction, no destination, just constantly plodding their way across the old wood of the floor of the Slocum house. And so hearing this, they figure that they've found the person, and they yell, you know, "Excuse me, sir, you cannot be in here right now. We need to get you out of the house. Come out." And as soon as those words come out of their mouth, they're hearing these steps, and then all of a sudden, they fall silent. And the officers, just imagine, just stare at that door, waiting to see what might possibly come out. And then the steps slowly start to move again in their heavy manner as before. And then they turn, and all of a sudden they start to reach the doorway, and then the steps enter into the hall, and the officers are just staring intently down the hallway, just looking at what has walked out, which is nothing. And the steps slowly turn and start to walk right towards one of the officers. And they get probably about where the stage is to you right here, distance. And then all of a sudden, the steps stop again. And the officers burst into laughter. And they turn around and they both go downstairs. And as they walk downstairs, the city worker is looking at him very confused, like, what is going on? He's like, what's happening, you guys? Like, I heard you laugh and all this stuff, and I figured you were gonna come downstairs with like a naked guy in clogs. And they said, you know, here's what happened. And they tell him about that entire story that had just happened to them upstairs. And he looks at them and he says, why on earth would you ever laugh at that? That is terrifying. And they said, for years, we've heard of officers coming to the house to have, you know, maybe look at the park, or there's something happening, and maybe they're in the basement or they're in the place, and they'll feel a breeze on their neck, or someone will tap their shoulder, or maybe they'll hear a rapping on the door, or something will go missing, and these strange occurrences happen, and these officers are always just very nervous to go in the house. And these 2 officers were the ones who always made fun of those officers. And they said, friend, those days are over. So Jeff, you've had tons of ghost stories, and you do a lot of military history and know a lot about Officers Row. Oh, thank you. So you know a lot about Officers Row, and that's a place where people love. You do the spirit tales. You do the walks at Officers Row. So do you know anything about Officers Row haunted history?
I do, and here's the interesting thing. A lot of times you hear a ghost story, even if it's factually based, like ours are, and then you say, when did it happen? Oh, 20 years ago or some time ago, or a friend of a friend. And this particular ghost story is actually current. These events happened last year because I talked to some of the staff at the Grant House restaurant. Now, the Grant House itself, and show of hands, I can see everybody because I have supernatural vision. How many people have actually been to the Grant House? It is the first building, foundations were laid when the Army arrived in 1849. And it's the oldest remaining building, of course. And it originated as a combination commander's residence, post headquarters, and it would have also doubled bachelor officer's mess and other functions. Now, starting by 1887, the Grant House became exclusively the officers' club because they shifted the commanders and the headquarters to other buildings. And it remained that till the end of World War I. And after World War I, it was the post library. After World War II, it sat vacant for, I don't know, Pat, 7, 8 years until they turned it into a museum. And then, as I tell people on my tour, then it became, after a few years, a museum and a folk art center, and then a museum and folk art center and restaurant. Now it is just simply a restaurant. And I eat there, not that they pay me for a plug, but it's pretty good food. So you've got 160 some years to accumulate ghost stories. And there are several different stories that come down to us. Now this particular story actually starts off the internet. And we all know, if it's on the internet, it must be true, right? Especially like a Facebook meme. But it's a starting point. Now, it starts off, and this does sound kind of classic. My friends and I were walking along Officers Row, playing Pokemon Go at 2 in the morning.
Terrifying.
It's terrifying in many ways. And all the lights are off along the road, but we see the lights in the Grant House, they're on. They're up. It's like 2 in the morning, and they can kind of hear like kind of crowd talk, party talk, and noises. So they walk up the front porch, and half of the windows, the shutters are closed, but a couple of the windows, the shutters are open. And they look through the windows, and hey, now I can see you all. And it's pretty frightening. Anyway, inside, through the windows, they see a party going on. They see women in long flowing dresses, and they see men in 19th century military dress uniforms. And there's a whole party going on. And they watch it for some seconds or some minutes. And then eventually somebody in the party looks out the window and sees them. And everybody freezes, and then all of a sudden lights go off, people are gone, and the party's over. So this is a starting point. Other stories like this are out there, but they haven't really, nobody has come forward and said, I saw this. But mixed in with this, people talk. Some of the staff have talked about kind of this feeling like somebody's watching over the house. And sometimes they like some of the servers, sometimes they don't. Like, the management's still there, the old management. Now, what happened last year, everybody, I hope, who was here remembers we had all the forest fires and the heat wave in August into September. And it was in that time period that they hired a new chef. And big guy, not afraid of very much, I don't think. And he had arrived early in the morning. He was bringing stock in to the restaurant. And he was at the north end of the building, the far end, not the opposite end of Officers Row. And he saw, walking around outside, and he described it as a woman, a tall woman, wearing a long blue dress. She had long dark hair down to her shoulders. And the thing that was remarkable is it was an old-fashioned dress, but it had big puffy shoulders, sort of like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, kind of puffy. I thought that was funny. Anyway, and she was beautiful. He was close enough to see her features, and she seemed to be looking around. And he walked over and said, "Can I help you?" And as you might expect, as soon as he started focusing on her and walking toward her, she just simply disappeared. And they said, "Oh, it's the blue lady." And that's when they started talking about, again, some of these, what you think would be internet legends. Except this guy actually saw her. Now, it was October, and the rains finally started. And just toward closing, there was this couple who were in the restaurant eating, and they were in the solarium. It's at the north corner of the building. Now, the solarium is a room with all glass walls. And it's kind of interesting, you put a solarium facing the north end of the building, but that's what they did. It makes sense. Yeah, it is an army building, so. Now, the entrance to the solarium, the inside entrance was at one corner, one end of the solarium, and then the solarium ran the north length of the building, and then there's an exterior door, glass door. And there was just a husband and wife, and the husband was facing the door, and you could see out because it wasn't quite dark yet. And his wife was to his right, kind of like our positions right now, Brad. And they were talking and eating, and so there he was. He probably was in the army because by all accounts he was kind of like making the circular motion, feeding himself. But his wife saw him kind of talking to her and eating, and then he stopped. He froze, fork in midair, and he just looked outside. And then she saw him stiffen up, and his jaw dropped, and he got really pale, and he dropped the fork and jerked, and he said, "Did you see her? Did you see it? Did you see her?" And she said, "What are you talking about? You didn't see her?" No. I saw outside a woman kind of walking out in the rain on that outside of the building, and she seemed to be looking for something, but all of a sudden she was in the solarium here with us, not too far from the door, and she stopped and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and our eyes locked. And suddenly she seemed to make up her mind about something. She seemed to shrug, and then she turned around as if she was going to walk out, but she disappeared before she could even reach out and get the doorknob. "And you didn't see that?" And she said, "No." And it was at that point that they called the server and they said, "Is this place haunted?" And the staff said, "Yeah." And they ended up kind of querying, so I was coming in between tours. This happened actually after one of my tours finished, so I heard about the next day. Now, if I could take an extra moment to talk about finding the identity of a ghost that you think you're trying to figure out which living person is it that we're tracking down. Now, in the history of the Grant house, there are two clues. One is how she was dressed, period clothing, but also the time period, now leading me to certain conclusions. When the Grant house was the officers' club from 1886 to the end of World War I, there would have been a committee of officers in charge of the money. But because of the training and the expertise, the person who actually ran this place as a club day to day would have been a woman. These Army officers might well have known how to move 1,000 men from the Vancouver barracks to the Philippines, but putting on a party, having the right food, the menu, hiring and firing servants, and soothing the cook instead of having them drink the sherry, that really would have been the job of a very capable and strong-willed woman, because she would have also had to have stood up to some of these drunken officers after the party. And so that is who I and the staff at the Grant House think that this is. This is the head housekeeper of the Grant House. And based on the clothing, especially the puffy sleeves, the dress seems to date from the 1890s, putting it well within that period.
So you're telling me that blue lady on the Go game that I keep trying to catch, it might be her. So Pat, it looks like I still have some beer left. So I think we have another story.
How about one that takes up 3 places? Same story, 3 places. There is a building downtown It has terracotta tiling on the outside, little building, corner of 6th and Main. And today it's one of my favorite places. It's the Firehouse Glass Building Studio. If you haven't been there, go. But it was not always a glass blowing studio. It was at one time an insurance office. Before that it was a bank. And the insurance office, the people reported that there was someone behind them watching them. It was very uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable. But they could hear them breathing behind them. But of course, when they turned to look and yell at whoever was right behind them, there was no one there. So let's go back to when it was indeed a bank. And the story of Charlie Brown. We'll say Charles Brown. Charles Brown was the president of the bank. Mr. Canby, now there's a name in the Pacific Northwest, E.F. Canby was the manager, the bank manager. And they were both obviously very upstanding, well-known members of the community. Mr. Brown had been a city council member for a couple of terms. He had been the county auditor for 4 terms. These were two, and the Canbys, of course, they named a town after Mr. Canby. And his, Mr. Canby had married a relative of the Slocums. They were, Ada Brown's name is on the side of the Clark County Historical Museum as part of the committee that built the museum. And we had gone through a financial crisis in 1898 and through 1902. In fact, there was a time when money, they wondered if our money was even going to have any value. Mr. Brown had made some really bad loans to friends of his in the community. Mr. Canby had moved money around from account to account to keep these loans from going into default. All in all, it was a not quite criminal action, but as close as you can come. And then the worst thing that a bank president or manager can imagine happened, and that was the state bank examiner came to the door. And he began to go through the books. And he started early in the morning. And that afternoon, Mr. Canby was becoming more and more nervous. He went into his office, he pulled out a revolver, ran out the back door of the bank, and the gun jammed. And he came back in the bank, and he practically threw himself into the arms of Mr. Brown and said, "We are undone." And the bank manager nodded his head. And so the two of them waited till that evening. All the employees left. The bank manager said he would be back, or the bank examiner said he would be back in the morning. And the two of them locked up the bank. There was a playground just a block away where Mr. Canby's son often played. They walked up there. The boy wasn't playing, so they continued on to our second location. And that is a beautiful Ampere house, which is on Daniels and 11th, just behind the church. There's the Crossroads Church, the great church that was at one time the Columbia Arts Center. Before that was a Presbyterian church. Right behind that is this beautiful, one of the oldest houses in Vancouver. Beautiful little house, now law offices. They stopped and looked in the window, and neighbors saw him staring through the window. And then they continued to walk, and they walked north. And they walked up Kaufman to what is now 39th and Kaufman. There are now apartment buildings. I've never talked to the people in those duplexes, if they've ever seen it either. But there, Mr. Canby and Mr. Brown each wrote notes, put them in their pockets. Mr. Canby took the revolver and shot himself in the head. And Mr. Brown took the gun from his hand and did the same and fell over Mr. Canby's body there in the field at 39th and Coffee. I'm trying to imagine what had gone through Mr. Brown's mind as he looked in the window of that house where he had celebrated elections, had celebrated honors, had celebrated recognition, and now to know he could never enter that house again except in shame and humiliation. And that must have been what they talked about as they made that long walk from 11th to 39th Street, and then to sit in that field and take their own lives. So I went into the glass blowing studio and I said, here's the story. Do you get the feeling that people are watching you? He said, that's what I do for a living, lady. So it was a perfect match of use of building and use of ghosts for that matter.
Well, I feel like we're just getting rolling, so I think Jeff and I might tell another story apiece. What do you think, Pat? So I think I'd be in trouble if I didn't talk about the museum tonight. So maybe I should tell some history about the museum. So the museum was built in 1909. It was a Carnegie library, and it was built with a $10,000 grant from Andrew Carnegie. And it was the first public building in Vancouver with electricity, correct? And it was originally designed to hold 25,000 books, and they couldn't even fill it in the beginning. They actually rented out the basement to the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the veterans for the Northern soldiers for the Civil War. And eventually, over time, it grew, and they ended up including more books. They eventually put a children's library in the basement, and after some time, it outgrew itself. And so in 1963, the Fort Vancouver Regional Library District moved out of the Vancouver Library out of that building, and they moved into the one on Mill Plain. And that's when the Clark County Historical Museum moved in 1964. And ever since, it's been a center of history and exploration and caring for our story in Clark County. And for me, that's where I have heard some haunting tales come from, is during the museum period. So I've heard two really good tales that I know about the museum. One is about a staff member, so one of my fellow co-workers from back in the day. The co-worker was actually in the basement one day, back in our collections room, which is kind of back behind some doors. And as they were working, you know, we're there sometimes late at night or early in the morning to try to work on exhibits and get some of the general work done before the public comes to the museum. And as they were sitting down at their desk, all of a sudden they began to just hear this really loud bang come from up above their head upstairs. And it kind of startled them. You know, you're focused in your work, you're doing your thing, you're making history. And they just got startled right out of their job. So they looked up for a second and they just kind of thought what was happening. And then all of a sudden they heard another really loud bang come from upstairs. And so they thought, you know, it's you know, not operational hours, someone must have gotten in, or maybe someone from the other staff came in and they are up in the closet upstairs, our storage closet, maybe a box has fallen, maybe something's happening, maybe someone's in trouble. So they kind of start to rush out of the collections room, they go through a set of doors into our research library, and they turn to start heading up these stairs that lead to the main floor of the building. And as they're going, there's two sets of stairs that take you up. One set that goes this way and one set that goes that way. So you have to hit a landing to turn. And as they're turning, they hit this landing, and all of a sudden, they keep hearing the bang, but then another sound gets added to it. They start to hear this sound of kind of footsteps scurrying back and forth across the main gallery. area. Like there's multiple people kind of walking around and going back and forth, and like there's a whole bunch of stuff happening up there. And then, you know, when you're walking kind of past a crowd or you're like at a concert, you hear that like kind of audible murmur of a bunch of voices talking, but you can't like distinctly pick out the sound. They started to hear that, but kind of like in whispered tones of all these voices just kind of whispering in this, you know, unintelligible way that they couldn't tell, but they felt like it was a lot of people moving around and talking and all of this stuff happening and all this commotion. And so as they hit that that first landing, they started to kind of rush up further, thinking, wow, this is serious trouble. People are in the museum, this is not okay. And they started to eventually get right up towards the top of the stairs, and all of a sudden, they just like busted right out at the top of the stairs where our main lobby area is at. And they look, and there's not a soul in sight. And it's pitch black through the entire museum. All the galleries just dark. And there's no sound, almost more quiet than it was when it was quiet before, just this deafening quiet. And so they nervously start to look through the galleries of the museum to see if anyone has been hiding or if there's anything happening. They check the doors are all locked, and they go through all 4 of the galleries that we have at the museum, and then eventually they kind of look in what's our break room, and they don't see anything, and there's one last place that's left, and it's that closet. And so they nervously go over the closet, and they reach for the door, and they slowly turn the handle and push the door open. And as the door opens, they just feel unsettled. They feel like as they look in, they just cannot see what's happening. Normally there's these kind of emergency lights that cast a light, or there's lights, ambient light, that'll cast these lights into the closet. You'll kind of see the back shelf with the books and the different items that are in there, but it seems like this black is so dark to them that it is just like absorbing all light and not allowing it to pass through the threshold of the door. And so they're standing here thinking, what am I gonna do? And they slowly reach their hand into the room, and they flip on the light switch, and there's no one there. And so they closed the door, and they got their stuff, and they left for the day. So, you know, as a museum, we have staff, but we also have volunteers. And we are very kind to our volunteers. We want to make sure they can get all kinds of experiences. So one day we had a volunteer that was down in that same collections room in the basement. And the basement, like I said, that lower level used to be the children's library. And that volunteer was sitting there and working on their computer. And as they were staring intently, kind of cataloging collections and doing all the different things to help make sure we could do our work, they all of a sudden got that really uncanny feeling like someone was just staring at them. You know that feeling when someone is looking at you and you can just feel it, you feel compelled to look up. I do not have that sense. So as he's sitting there, he slowly starts to look up to see if someone's walked in the room, but he knows he's not. He knows he's alone. And he looks straight ahead and slowly starts to scan the room. And as he's scanning the room, all of a sudden his eyes locked with a little boy. And he said he was dressed in, you know, early 20th century period clothing. And as soon as his eyes locked with the little boy, he vanished right in front of his eyes. And so the volunteer grabbed his things, he walked up the stair, and he left the building. And he called back later and he said, I am so sorry, but this is what I saw, and I was terrified, and I just had to get out of there. So, when I'm there at night, I put headphones on, I keep my head down, and I just try to make sure that I don't lock eyes with any of these things. So Jeff, I still got you. You have one more.
This was not necessarily on Officers Row. It was further down in one of the buildings that still exists off of Fort Vancouver Way is the auditorium building. And if you've driven through the barracks on Fort Vancouver Way, headed south, look to the left, It's a big, long, low building, and oh, by the way, it says auditorium on it. Now, this building was built as part of the revamping. In the early 1900s, the post was revamped to support larger troop movements and a larger number of troops stationed there. And of course, it included more troop barracks, headquarters, hospital, and this auditorium for recreation. Now, by about 1990, at that time, I was in the Army Reserves, and I was a second lieutenant, and it was used sometimes for an auditorium. It was multi-purpose, but in the basement space of this building, there had been originally built a firing range. It's later on they had to remove it because somebody came through with the detectors and said, "No wonder you Army people are crazy. You got lead." Now, in those years, up until them shutting it down in about 1990 or 1985, and in the mid-90s removing the lead, they ended up putting a whole bunch of 2x4s and chicken wire in and creating these storage units in there. And my Army Reserve unit owned a couple of these storage units. And we were given access to the building. I had keys and combinations to the electronic locks. So my unit was drilling 4 hours from 7 to 11 p.m. on a Monday night. And our main building no longer exists. It was torn down a couple of years ago, but a detachment of my soldiers said, "Lieutenant Davis, we're going to go over to where the storage is and go through some of our equipment." And so I said, "Okay, thanks for letting me know, guys." And so they left. Now, by about 10 o'clock, they weren't back yet. And so I'm looking at my watch and saying, "You know what, we've got to start checking out and getting ready to leave." So I walked over to the building, and if you ever get a chance to go over there, it's got a big, broad front, and there's a pediment that has a little bit of cover from the rain. So I punched in my code into the outer doors. Open the outer doors. Now, there's an entryway and some stairs, and that will lead you through some other double doors to the main floor. However, if you look to the right, if you happen to get in, look to the right, there's just a door, just a plain, simple door, and that's what led down into the basement. It's a very small door. It opens up to a very broad staircase, and I know, Pat, you've been there. It's a long kind of sloping staircase, very broad, about 10 feet wide, and I walked down the stairs. I got to the foot of the stairs, and I was looking forward where our cage was, and my guys weren't there. And so I kind of turned and looked, and they were at the back of the building behind the stairs. And they said, joyously, "Lieutenant Davis!" Now, when a senior sergeant with 15 years of experience is happy to see a second lieutenant in the second year of his commission, there's something wrong. And I said, "Gentlemen," they said, "Lieutenant Davis, again, all enthused." I said, "Gentlemen, what's wrong? We're just happy to see you." Why? Well, it's not really that it's you, sir. It's just we're happy to see anyone coming down these stairs, because about 10 minutes before you came in, we heard the door open. The main door is open. We heard it slam shut. And we heard somebody open the door to the stairs. We heard them walk down the stairs. And rather than kind of coming around to where we could see them, they made a right turn. And at the foot of the stairs on the right-hand side, that was the entrance to the latrine, which is the Army means bathroom. Go figure. But they heard somebody walk into the latrine, and they knew they did because they had these saloon doors as the entrance. So there was boom, 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 these doors when this person walked in, and then they heard a stall door open and close. So one of them went forward and looked to see who it was, and there was nobody there. So they were back there puzzling what was going on, and I really think they were debating, how are we going to get out of here, because we now have to walk past the latrine to get out. And that's when I opened the door and came down the stairs. And so they weren't sure if the first ghost didn't have a friend arriving too. Now, at this time, I was not as much interested in history or military history as I am now, and I certainly didn't know as much about the history of the Vancouver Barracks as I do now. I didn't know at the time, and most other people didn't know, that, of course, the landscape is used and reused over time. That when the Hudson's Bay Company was on the land in the 1820s, they brought in Christian missionaries. At a certain point, they consecrated a graveyard. And dozens and dozens of people were buried there. And, oh, by the way, that graveyard is the same piece of land where they built the auditorium in the early 1900s. So the graveyard was abandoned for many, many years. It was overgrown. The grave markers, most of them deteriorated and rotted away. And the Army did try and move their graveyard and possibly, probably, this Hudson's Bay Company graveyard, but we know they missed some because a few years later, when they were removing the concrete floor, they had to remove part of the concrete floor, and they found the remains of people who were still in their graves. But that's another story.
Wow, these are some incredible, scary stories that we have here tonight. And, you know, being out here with our fire in this safe forest, one place that I like to think about that I'm sure is nice, warm, and safe, and there's probably amazing movies and great events happening at is the Kiggins Theatre. I can only imagine what people are enjoying at the theater right now. Probably an amazing time. And you know, Kiggins Theatre was built by J.P. Kiggins, a 9-time mayor of the city of Vancouver, 2-time Clark County Commissioner, most instrumental person in helping on this side build the interstate bridge and really put Vancouver on the map in the early 20th century.
And probably most importantly, he was Corporal Kiggins of the 14th Infantry Regiment before he settled in Vancouver.
And so just thinking about that theater, Pat, you know, all those people there feeling safe and calm and happy. There's no way that they're in a haunted building right now, right, Pat? Or do you know the story?
I've talked to people who work here, of course, and the present owner did tell me that as he walked into the projection room, there was a shadow that passed in front of him. But there is no way anyone could come out of the projection room and get past it because it's a very small room. You know, before Dan took it over, and it was in pretty sad shape when Dan took it over, and it was closed for a long time. But people walking by the front could smell popcorn, but there was no one here. I think they were just waiting for Dan's really good. And as they started, we're not done yet. Some of the employees, when the films are over, sometimes they're not that interesting, perhaps, and someone might doze off because they would see someone in the second row here and come down to tell them, you know, hey, the show's over. And by the time they got down there was no one there. So who might be sitting next to you? You know, look at them closely. And when the lights go up, make sure they're still there.
Thank you, Pat. Well, it's been a long, fun evening telling some haunted tales around the campfire tonight. I want to thank you, Pat, for coming out this evening. This next story is a publication Pat wrote many years ago, and then you're putting out a new book that's going to come out.
It'll be out in March.
Nice. So keep an eye out for that. And then Jeff has written several books. I'll let you talk a little bit about your books and your tours real quick.
Oh, thank you very much. Over the years, I've written or contributed to a number of books on history, military history, like Pat has, as well as the paranormal. Perhaps my more famous book was one called Weird Washington. And here to Oregon, but I kind of threw a wide lasso. I collected ghost stories from around the Pacific Northwest. And as well as last year, I did publish Vancouver, USA Ghost, which is very heavily reliant on stories from the Vancouver barracks. And that kind of leads me to, I do. I'm sure the grammar police will be after me for that one. Currently, Spirit Tales of the Vancouver Barracks is my own ghost walk, and the kind of ticketing is concurrent with the Clark County Historical Museum website, but they are running Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays from now through actually the first weekend in November. Thank you.
All right, and obviously I mentioned at the museum we're doing our haunted walking tours the 25th through the 30th of this month at 6:30 and 7:30 p.m. And I've heard a rumor that there is a interesting guide on the 7:30 p.m. tour that you might want to join and have some stories be told by. So at this point, we figured we might open it up for some questions and answers. There's a mic over there. If anyone wants to ask us any questions about the stories or the history that we talked about tonight. And if you don't have any questions, we can go home. All right, awesome. Well, thank you. Oh, she's got one question. We got a question, folks.
My husband and I took the tour with Jeff. It was the first tour of the year. And he told a pretty darn good story from the hospital. And a story that he himself experienced. So I was wondering if you would be interested in telling that one.
The whole long 20-minute story? Footnotes. The Vancouver Barracks Hospital is one of the stops on my walk because I try and put as many of my own personal stories in as possible. And even if I have to invent to myself, gosh darn it. Now, I got to make it clear, we can't go into a lot of these buildings because they are either shut down for maintenance or they're being rented out to other people. But this hospital, built in 1904, was the epitome of late 19th, early 20th century medicine, which means you don't want to go there if you're sick. As far as ghosts go, perhaps one that I can share easiest is that very quickly is I was looking for a bathroom, any bathroom at a certain point. So on the second floor, I found the women's restroom. And one of the interesting things about it was that all the toilet seat lids were up, which is something, I'd never been in a women's bathroom before, but I was pretty certain that wasn't normal. And my wife had guessed that it was the cleaning staff that left them up, but I closed them all. The next person to visit found them all back up again. So in between visits, the toilet seat lids kept on going up and down. And if you visit my website, which is spelled out one word, ghostsandcritters.com, on the left-hand side, there's a button that says Sounds of Ghosts. If you click on that and open it up, you can listen to a series of audio bites taken on our second visit. We put a cassette recorder in there, and starting about midnight, go figure, over a 15-minute period, we had several audible bites of sound that sounded to us like they were inside the bathroom. So you get a chance, free. Just visit the website to actually make up your own mind about these sounds. So thanks for the segue.
All right, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to, we do have another question. Look at that. We have a lively crowd.
So if Yackle stands in the, was it Chinook or Klickitat language for haunted valley, how haunted is Yackle?
Pretty haunted. That was from the pre-European settlement days. And their history says that children went hunting huckleberries there, and demons took them. And so they would not go into that valley at all. So that's when they told the settlers, you don't want to go in there. The Yakko burned, by the way, it never burned. Yakko, it stopped, it would not come in. The Yakko burn would not burn Yakko.
Oh, we got another question over here.
I just asked what year was the fire of the little boy and
John Gentry, was it 79 or 89?
95.
95. John worked, and you all know I hate dates. And people always ask me dates, and I try not to remember dates. So I will go to someone who does remember dates. But John Gentry actually was one of the investigators on that fire.
what fire is it?
The one where the little boy died.
The one at 6th and Broadway. The first story.
I don't mean if I have to fill out a teacher.
And thank you for what you do.
What do you know about the most haunted cemetery in Vancouver?
I have never heard of a ghost in Singapore.
I don't think anybody ever knows it.
Yeah, I'll actually have to second and third the two of them. This is interesting. A clairvoyant friend put it to me this way. She said, I don't see any ghosts of the people buried here standing around their graves. It's not like the play Our Town. What she said was, the aura a lot of people will get in a cemetery is actually what some people call a remnant. It's an emotional layering on the landscape, and it is the grief of all of the mourners. The people who stood by the graves had left some kind of an imprint. And so, and it makes sense to me. If I rematerialized after death and found myself in a cemetery surrounded by the crew of Our Town, I wouldn't want to be there either. I would go home. So, but history, say again?
So all of them?
All and none. It's almost every cemetery I've ever been, even if they remove some of the gravestones, you still have that aura. But I think it's not personality driven so much as psychic flavor. I just coined that phrase. I'll have to talk to her. Yeah. Pat looks like she's going to say something.
No, I'm just agreeing with you because I have never, ever heard a report of a ghost in any of our cities. And we had 3 that are run by the city.
Yeah.
And then there's Catholic Cemetery, Evergreen, we've got the private cemetery.
As kind of a sidebar, as I was talking about underneath the auditorium, that seemed pretty not tame, but the only time anything did weird happen, really, like somebody said, oh my God, it's the spirit of the dead, is when they had to remove the bones during lead abatement and then they put them back. And that is a whole large, lengthy story. Roy Wilson, who you met, was the Cowlitz tribal spiritual leader, and he and I also talked about that. But that's like a pretty isolated case. As far as all the public cemeteries and the military cemetery as well. I've never heard of anything about a haunting, even though there was that car accident where a car missed the turn and it spun out into the cemetery, and I think it was the driver, was killed. And but that even itself doesn't seem to have left a haunt.
They did move graves so often. And that cemetery that you spoke of was of course, the St. James, the Padres there, St. James Mission, and that went all the way past the auditorium, all the way up to where the Veterans Memorial is today. And we know that Dr. John McLaughlin's son was buried there somewhere. And they moved those up to Evergreen and Reserve. Evergreen and West Reserve, they started a new cemetery there. Before that, townspeople could come in and bury in that cemetery. The city did not have a cemetery of its own. And then, was it 1876 that the Army said townspeople can't bury there?
Yeah, and then they, also we're starting to like get this whole historical part. I hope you're all interested in this because this is the oddities. As a military historian, I learned never to ask why did you do this because the answer is it seemed like a good idea at the time. What Pat and I are talking about is what do the people do when there aren't enough cemeteries for the military and civilians? I believe you're right, in the 1870s, late 1870s, Vancouver, you have to found your own cemetery, but in 1880, 81, they said we want to move the cemeteries off the post, and they took out the ads in the Vancouver Independent saying, for Monty Python fans, bring out your dead, because we're going to move them anyway.
Families could come and claim their loved ones if there were families left.
Yeah.
And then again, there was a cemetery at Fort Dallas where they brought all those soldiers, they closed that cemetery, and moved them, and let the families come get their loved ones if they wanted, but they didn't keep records, so there's a lot of unknowns from that movement.
Yeah, the Army...
It's very, cemetery history is, to people like us, interesting.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the logbook that the quartermaster took running the cemetery disappeared about the same time as they moved the cemeteries.
Yeah.
And Old City Cemetery was established in 1867.
1867.
And they actually, one of the famous people that was moved there was Esther Short.
She was buried in your backyard originally.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I like
I just know
that.
where she's at now. And that's where her grave remains to this day, is in Old City Cemetery in downtown Vancouver.
Another tidbit, that is the only grave that the city is required to maintain.
Oh, wow. I did not know.
I was there.
So if anyone else has any other questions, we want to, we got one last. So why is the city required?
Yeah, when they moved her in the deed, because she had given so much to the city. Esther Short Park, of course, but also the waterfront for a public wharf forever. And her family then requested that the city pledge to maintain her grave forever. And so that's in the paperwork. But they maintain all of the other graves too, but that's the one that they're required to.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. So keep an eye out next year for more History on Tap. We're going to start back up in January. I want to thank the Kiggins Theatre, the City of Vancouver, the VDA, Trapdoors, Zeppelin, and the Courtney Urban Trust for all the support, and all of you for being out here tonight. Have a good evening.